On the morning of February 14th, 1779, three Patriot militiamen from Georgia find themselves separated from the rest of their column, lost in a swamp along the banks of a small stream called Kettle Creek. Trying to work their way back toward their own lines, they stumble instead onto the exposed flank of a Loyalist officer named James Boyd, a man they were not even looking for and had no idea was standing so close by. Almost by reflex, they raise their muskets and fire. Boyd falls, mortally wounded, and within minutes, an entire Loyalist regiment that had been winning the battle just moments earlier collapses into panic and flight. Nobody planned that shot. It happened almost entirely by accident, and it would go on to help unravel one of Britain's most confident assumptions about how the southern colonies could be won back. By early 1779, British strategy in the American Revolution had shifted decisively toward the South, built on a specific, and as it turned out, badly mistaken assumption. British planners believed that Georgia and the Carolinas were full of quiet Loyalist sympathizers, simply waiting for a chance to rise up and support the crown once British regulars arrived to protect them. This so-called Southern strategy was meant to correct course after British efforts to subdue the northern colonies had produced mixed results at best, particularly following the disastrous defeat at Saratoga and the resulting French alliance that had transformed the war into a much larger conflict than London originally anticipated. Acting on the belief that Loyalist sentiment ran deep in the South, British forces captured Savannah in late December of 1778, and by the end of January 1779, a British column under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell had marched inland and taken the town of Augusta without serious resistance, a rapid and encouraging start to the new campaign. To capitalize on the moment, Campbell began actively recruiting, and by early February, roughly 1,100 local men had signed loyalty oaths, though relatively few of these actually formed into organized fighting units, a detail that should have given British planners more pause than it apparently did. Campbell also dispatched officers into the surrounding backcountry, specifically to recruit additional Loyalists into organized militia units further afield, and one of those officers, a South Carolina-based Loyalist colonel named James Boyd, found remarkable early success, gathering several hundred recruits as he marched south to rejoin Campbell at Augusta. By the time Boyd's column reached central Georgia, it numbered somewhere between 600 and 800 men, a real and growing force that seemed to confirm exactly what British planners had been hoping to find all along, even as Boyd's men plundered and pillaged along their route in ways that were already drawing angry Patriot militia out of the surrounding countryside to oppose them. British commanders had good reason on paper to expect this strategy to work. Georgia had been the last of the 13 colonies founded, its population smaller and more recently established than its neighbors, and a meaningful portion of its settlers had genuine ties to the crown or simply preferred to avoid taking sides in a conflict that, as far as many of them were concerned, was being fought largely by wealthier planters and merchants elsewhere. Standing against this growing Loyalist tide was a Georgia militia officer named Elijah Clarke, a frontier farmer with little formal education who had already built a reputation for aggressive, relentless resistance against both British forces and Loyalist militia operating in the Georgia backcountry. Clarke had no illusions about the danger Boyd's growing column represented. Clarke had emigrated to Georgia from North Carolina as a young man with little money and even less formal education, building a modest farm on the frontier before the war interrupted everything, and the conflict had already cost him and his neighbors dearly in raids and reprisals from both regular British troops and local Loyalist militia who knew the same backcountry as well as he did. If Boyd successfully reached Augusta with several hundred armed and organized recruits, British control over the Georgia interior would be dramatically reinforced, exactly the kind of momentum the Southern strategy needed to succeed in its opening weeks. Clarke joined forces with fellow Georgia Colonel John Dooley and South Carolina Colonel Andrew Pickens, whose combined militia force numbered only around 340 men, considerably fewer than Boyd's growing column of Loyalist recruits. Just days before the battle that would decide the issue, this combined Patriot force had already struck at a fortified position called Carr's Fort, skirmishing with Loyalist troops in the area and staying close enough on Boyd's trail to have a real chance of catching him before he reached the safety of Augusta's British garrison and Campbell's protection. On February 14th, Boyd's column paused to rest on the north side of Kettle Creek, and needing food for his growing force, ordered his men to slaughter and butcher cattle they had found grazing nearby, a routine and seemingly harmless halt that would prove disastrous in its timing. Pickens, alerted to Boyd's position by a scout named Captain James McCall, who had gotten close enough to observe the Loyalist camp without being detected, organized his combined force into 3 columns for a coordinated assault meant to settle the matter decisively. Pickens himself would lead the center directly at the main camp, while Dooley's column crossed the creek to strike from one flank and Clarke's column crossed to strike from the other, a plan designed to fully surround Boyd's position and cut off any possible escape route before the attack even began in earnest. The plan began to unravel almost immediately. Pickens's advance guard, under strict orders not to fire until the main assault was ready, grew impatient as they approached Boyd's sentries and opened fire prematurely, alerting the entire Loyalist camp to the danger well before the encircling flanks were anywhere near position. Boyd reacted quickly and competently, personally leading roughly 100 men up a hill directly in Pickens's path and taking position behind a hastily improvised breastwork built from an old fence line and fallen trees. When Pickens's column came into view, Boyd's men opened fire from that elevated, defended position, inflicting real casualties, and for a period, genuinely controlling the shape of the battle. Meanwhile, on both flanks, the swampy, waterlogged ground around the creek slowed Dooley's and Clarke's columns to a crawl, forcing men to wade through cane thickets and standing water that made any kind of coordinated timing essentially impossible to maintain. The encircling maneuver that was supposed to trap Boyd's entire force from 3 directions simultaneously fell badly behind schedule, and for a stretch of the battle that must have felt considerably longer to the men fighting it, the numerically smaller Patriot force, its flanking column stalled in the mud, was taking real losses against a well-positioned defender who appeared, for the moment, to hold every advantage the terrain and preparation could offer him. If you are learning something from this breakdown, take a second and hit subscribe. We cover overlooked battles and turning points like this every week, and what happens next is one of the strangest strokes of chance in the entire war. It was in the middle of this chaos, with Dooley's and Clarke's columns still struggling through the swamp on either side of the creek, that 3 Patriot militiamen from Clarke's own column became separated from the rest of their unit, disoriented in the difficult terrain and unable to see more than a few yards through the undergrowth around them. Working their way back toward the sound of the fighting, they emerged directly onto the exposed flank of Boyd's defended position, a location neither they nor anyone else on the Patriot side had specifically planned to reach at that moment. Seeing Boyd himself at close range, they fired, and Boyd went down with a mortal wound, struck by men who almost certainly had no idea in the confusion exactly who they had just hit. The effect was immediate and total. Watching their commander fall, the Loyalist defenders who had been holding the advantage only moments earlier broke and scattered, streaming back toward the main body of Boyd's column in disorder. Command passed to Boyd's third-ranking officer, Major William Spurgeon, since Boyd's designated second-in-command was, by most accounts, unwilling or unable to take charge of the collapsing situation. Spurgeon managed to organize a fighting withdrawal across the creek, and for a time it looked as though a significant portion of the Loyalist force might still escape the trap entirely, slipping away while the Patriot columns remained bogged down. It was at this point that Clarke, whose own column had finally fought its way across the swamp, spotted high ground on the far side of the creek that the retreating Loyalists appeared to be making for, and pushed his own men to reach it first, having his horse shot out from under him in the process, before continuing the fight on foot alongside his men. Reinforced soon afterward by Pickens's and Dooley's men, who had finally crossed the creek themselves, Clarke's renewed attack broke the reforming Loyalist line for good, and after roughly 90 additional minutes of fighting, what remained of Boyd's command collapsed into full retreat, abandoning horses, weapons, and supplies as they fled in every direction. Exact casualty figures from Kettle Creek vary considerably between contemporary accounts, a common problem with smaller engagements fought far from any major press coverage or careful official record keeping. but the general shape of the outcome is not in dispute. Loyalist losses ran somewhere between 40 and 70 killed, with additional accounts suggesting total Loyalist casualties, including wounded, may have run as high as 200 out of the roughly 700 men engaged that day. Somewhere between 70 and 150 Loyalists were captured outright in the aftermath, and of the roughly 700 men who had set out under Boyd's command only weeks earlier, only around 270 ultimately reached Campbell's forces to be formally organized into British service, meaning well over half of Boyd's carefully recruited regiment simply evaporated, killed, captured, or scattered back to their homes discouraged by what they had just witnessed on that hillside. Patriot losses, by contrast, were remarkably light, generally cited around 7 to 9 killed and 14 to 23 wounded or missing, a striking outcome given how badly the battle had appeared to be going for Pickens's forces in its opening stages before Boyd's death changed everything in an instant. The timing of the defeat could not have been worse for British strategy in Georgia. On the very same day Boyd's column was being destroyed at Kettle Creek, Campbell, worried about a separate Patriot force gathering nearby and uncertain whether Boyd's reinforcements would ever actually arrive in time to matter, made the decision to abandon Augusta entirely and withdraw his garrison back toward the coast, a retreat that was already underway before news of Kettle Creek even reached him. The battle's real significance went well beyond one column of Loyalist recruits scattered on a single afternoon. It directly disproved the central assumption British planners had built their entire Southern strategy around, that large numbers of Southern colonists were quietly loyal to the Crown and simply needed protection to rise up openly and fight on Britain's behalf. Kettle Creek demonstrated instead that any Loyalist force operating away from the direct protection of a British garrison remained dangerously exposed to exactly the kind of fast, coordinated militia action that had just destroyed Boyd's command, chance battlefield accident included. In the aftermath, South Carolina authorities, hoping to discourage further Loyalist recruitment across the region, put a number of the captured men on trial for treason rather than treating them as conventional prisoners of war, and roughly half were convicted, with several ultimately executed, a harsh outcome that drew genuine outrage from British commanders, even as it sent its own unmistakable message to anyone else in the region considering Boyd's path. British General Augustine Prevost reportedly threatened retaliation against Patriot prisoners in his own custody, though he ultimately held back, wary of provoking similar treatment against British prisoners held elsewhere. Georgia's interior would not fully return to British control until the much larger fall of Charleston more than a year later, and even then, organized resistance in the backcountry never fully disappeared for the remainder of the war. The Kettle Creek battlefield is preserved today in Wilkes County, Georgia, a roughly 250-acre tract of quiet woodland surrounding the rise still locally known as War Hill, where Boyd made his stand behind a fence line that has long since disappeared back into the landscape. A handful of historical markers and a small cemetery mark the site today, well off any major highway, commemorating a battle that most Americans have never heard of despite the outsized role it played in unraveling British confidence in the entire Southern strategy just weeks after it had begun. Clarke would go on to fight for the rest of the war with the same relentless energy he showed that morning, and after the Revolution ended, he remained a controversial, larger-than-life figure on the Georgia frontier, later attempting to carve out his own short-lived breakaway settlement west of the state entirely, a venture that ultimately collapsed, but that speaks to just how restless and independent-minded the man leading that flanking column at Kettle Creek truly was. That settlement, later known as the Trans-Oconee Republic, was eventually dissolved under pressure from state authorities, but it left a permanent impression of a man who never fully stopped fighting for territory and independence on his own terms, whether the enemy in front of him wore a red coat or not. Standing on that quiet hillside today, it is worth remembering that the single moment that decided the entire battle was never part of anyone's plan. 3 lost, disoriented militiamen wandering out of a swamp did more to break Britain's Georgia gamble in a few seconds than either side's carefully drawn battle plan managed to accomplish on its own that entire morning. If this kind of overlooked turning point is your thing, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and leave a comment telling us which forgotten battle or commander you want us to cover next.